There's money to be made in the Amazon rainforest. The World Bank estimates that the rainforest generates an annual value of $317 billion US. Of the $317 billion, logging could contribute up to $43 to $98 billion. A vague number, but that is to be expected when considering the illegal activity associated with logging in the Amazon. The illegal logging in the Amazon occurs as people try to exploit natural resources for timber, ranching, soy, and mining. However, after a change of leadership in both Brazil and Colombia, logging in the Brazilian Amazon fell by 39%, according to the BBC. To explore what these numbers really mean and the effects that they have on people, I spoke with Christian Poirier, the Brazilian Programme Director for Amazon Watch. Amazon Watch is a 27-year-old non-governmental organisation based in California, working across Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador and Peru. I asked Christian if we could be optimistic for the future of the Amazon after the reported fall in logging numbers.
I would say yes. It's a sign that Brazil's institutions, its environmental and human rights institutions, have returned to a state where they can function properly, where their agents can operate with a certain level of autonomy without interference and without having their budgets completely slashed, as we saw under the Bolsonaro regime, predated the Lula administration. Lula made it a priority to undo the damage that Bolsonaro had inflicted on these institutions, some of them under the Ministry of the Environment, another being the State Agency for Indigenous Peoples called FUNAI. These institutions were largely gutted under Bolsonaro, and the people in charge of these institutions were exactly the contrary, exactly the opposite kind of person you'd want to have in place. For example, under Bolsonaro, the Minister of Environment was an environmental criminal by the name of Ricardo Salles, who was found to be part of a complex timber smuggling scheme. He was never found guilty of that, unfortunately, but it's pretty clear this guy had everything in mind that was not about forest protection. It was about deregulation. It was about trying to remove the ability of the state to uphold environmental law. So what we can be hopeful about today is that Lula has come back and placed a lot more resources and authority in the hands of these institutions so they can do what they're supposed to do, which is sort of environmental monitoring, command and control operations, and really sort of instilling a sense of governance where there was none previously. The fact that these agencies that are charged with upholding environmental law can actually operate with a certain amount of resources and autonomy as they're meant to, and not have the sort of high-level interference and not have extremely toxic and ineffective leadership, making sure they cannot do their jobs, has been a sea change in the ability of these agencies to do their job. And this also extends to governance of indigenous territories. This is an area that Amazon Watch does most of its work, is working alongside indigenous partners across the Amazon. And what we saw under Bolsonaro was a frontal attack on indigenous rights, largely because indigenous peoples steward the best protected forest in the Amazon. The areas that have the least deforestation, the least destruction, are indigenous territories, and that's precisely why the factions in Brazil's economy and its government are coveting these lands. For example, the agribusiness sector, the mining sector. And now I'm not saying that Lula isn't working with those sectors and giving them concessions, but Bolsonaro was entirely allowing them to potentially run his environmental and human rights policy, which was, of course, disastrous for indigenous peoples, it's disastrous for other forest peoples. And the fact that we see a better balance being struck, not perfect, I would say. Lula has a lot of work to do to improve a lot of his policies. Nonetheless, the fact that these agencies have been able to wrest themselves away from the direct control of the very forces that are hell-bent on destroying the forest and reducing indigenous land rights and protections over the forest has been a major reason why we've seen the fall in deforestation.
So what effects does logging have on the indigenous people living in the rainforest?
I've witnessed firsthand the effects of illegal logging on indigenous territories. Some of these territories in Brazil are not demarcated. They don't have official state protections. And that was very much a problem that was exacerbated by Bolsonaro, but continues to be a major issue in Brazil. So when you have indigenous land invaded by a range of actors, particularly illegal loggers, illegal miners, who are extremely violent in the way they kill you, or they coerce you, they poison your communities, they cause huge upheaval in indigenous communities by bringing in a lot of very destructive tendencies like drugs and prostitution and buying certain leaders and causing major divisions. So there's the social aspect of this, but the environmental aspect can't be understated. When you have invaders crisscrossing your land, removing timber, destroying sacred places, driving away game like for hunting, poisoning and sullying water sources, there's a whole range of environmental impacts that of course extend to the community who are feeling these impacts firsthand. One example of this in terms of violence is in the Araia-Boia indigenous territory in the state of Maranhão, Brazil. Araia-Boia is the territory of the Guajajara people. The Guajajara have put together a forest guard who in recent years have taken pretty dramatic steps to drive loggers off their lands. For example, if they find loggers and their equipment, they'll burn it, and they'll take the loggers in custody, they'll drive them off the land. They don't hurt the loggers, but they make them leave, and they destroy their often very valuable equipment. Well, this has led to a number of their forest guardian rangers being killed, and others being driven into hiding. Because, as I mentioned, these are very, very violent factors, or vectors, you could say, of destruction. And one thing we've worked on a lot is illegal mining. Mining is not known for causing vast deforestation. Like what we often see with logging is you'll see the valuable timber being removed, and then you'll see the rest of the forest being burned. And that's a multiple step process. Clearing the forest, land grabbing, bringing in cattle. So one of the first steps is, of course, removing the valuable timber, and so that's a precursor to wholesale forest destruction. But illegal mining doesn't have the same process, but what it does lead to a lot of deforestation. It also leads to many of these issues I've mentioned in terms of social upheaval and the inability of forest guardians to do their job of protecting the forest by inflicting massive violence on them and the people of their communities.
Please could you go into more detail about the demarcation process and the other solutions Amazon Watch are doing to help protect indigenous people?
Under Brazil's constitution, 1988 constitution, indigenous peoples have the right to their ancestral territories, an inalienable right to their ancestral territories. It doesn't mean they're owners of the land. They're given permanent usufruct of these territories. And if once a land has passed through a multiple stage process, which can take many years, for example, and indigenous people will identify a territory that belongs to them ancestrally. They can prove that they were there for a certain period of time through archaeological remains. They can demonstrate reasonable boundaries of these territories. The state agrees to map the boundaries of the territories and create reports that are then accepted by agencies in the Brazilian government. And it goes through these steps, which are quite rigorous and take many years and often are blocked by actors who do not want to see the territories demarcated, for example, in the agribusiness sector. Once they've gone through all these processes, this land is then titled. It receives a federal title which grants it federal protections. And the state will come and put up signs along the borders of the territory, warning invaders to keep out. And it therefore becomes some of the best protected land in Brazil as a result. And say the national forests and because there's many different layers of land protections in Brazil. Some are quite rigorous. Indigenous territories are one of the most rigorous, some less so. So this is a crucial step, an indigenous solution to forest destruction. Other solutions entail, for example, energy security. So one thing we've done at Amazon Watch is install solar panels in indigenous territories, remote territories that don't have access to energy from the national grid. Energy is used for a whole range of needs in the community. Lighting, nighttime school, like classes, for example, to powering internet, satellite internet systems, to supporting economic development, for example, allowing people to work in the evening, to create products that are sold in the local market. So these are solutions that will help build more robust kind of social conditions for people to stay on their land and not feel they have to leave, as many youth do, because the communities are living in what, well, many of us would consider to be poverty. I don't think that's necessarily the case with indigenous people who live in these communities, but if they're forced to endure popular culture images of wealth, they're being deprived of something, and if the community doesn't have access to local development, then it can cause people to leave. So these solutions to keeping people on their land, keeping traditions strong, language strong, is also essential to indigenous peoples continuing to do what is a service to us all, which is really working to keep the forest standing.